Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Rapici, how are you tonight?
Barry Falk, Dr. Barry Falk. I'm doing well. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am full of beans, dare I say, full of beans to discuss our hero, Tough Teddy Adorno, Theodore Adorno, and the form of the phonograph record. Now, I'm going to spring this on Michael now. Actually, he might start screaming, but I actually think we should have 2 episodes on Theodore Adorno. He's definitely not in the mood.
to even hear this. I don't have as many beans as you do. Well, I'm going to reserve the right to come back to that later.
And you know what? The future, as Joe Strummer said, the future is unwritten. And maybe there will be 1, maybe there will be 2, maybe there will be 10
there will
podcasts.
There will not be 10
on Theodore Adorno follows. But one thing we can say for sure, this episode is about Theodore Adorno, and it's about, in particular, his 1934, something that I found out from a book that I'll be referencing often because it's really, really smart, Jeffrey DeLeo's book, Final Theory. I'll probably end up referencing the piece a couple times, along with our discussion of the main text, which I don't know if I've identified it yet. It's a 1934 text by Theodore Adorno, and here is why I mentioned Jeffrey DeLeo. He mentions that this is actually a pseudonym. This is a piece that Adorno wrote under a pseudonym, and he didn't quite explain why. Maybe because it may just simply be a fact, or the deciding factor may have been that he was kind of working out his theory of the phonograph record in a couple different essays in a couple different ways, and he was literally, in the literal, the old school definition of the essay, he was kind of working out his ideas in the form of these essays. But at any rate, we're going to talk about a particular essay, The Form of the Phonograph Record by Theodore Adorno, and I'll say just 1 or 2 other things about it. I think what must be said about the form of the phonograph record, and I'll just get this in. The reason why I thought, why I was initially thinking that maybe this will be more than 1 episode is because Adorno wrote in the 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe, a couple of essays about music and phonograph records, and one called The Curves of the Needle, and also an essay about opera. But this essay about opera is really about how recordings of opera are in a way preferable to performances of opera. So there are a couple interesting takes. He's working out. He's working in a surprising groove, and this, and I think it's kind of worth exploring. Might be worth exploring. But back to this essay. One of the things I think we're going to end up talking about in this episode is that for a good bit of the essay, Tough Teddy is Tough Teddy, the Tough Teddy we know and love, whose basic take is that technology is the handmaiden of, I can't use that term. I already got, well, let's try that again. Technology is the servant, can I say that? Is the servant of capitalism, or is made to function according to capitalism. Capitalism really sets the game for technology, and is therefore, and most of this essay enumerates. So this is the Theodore Adorno that we recognize from, say, the culture industry, from the dialectic of enlightenment. And for most of the form of the phonograph record, we're getting a kind of tough-minded critique and a sort of demystification of the ways in which technological progress is sort of underwritten, or rather is bolstering kind of class domination and capitalist exploitation. Except, and this is the other thing we will talk about, near the end, Adorno has a very interesting reversal or something. Something happens there, or there seems to be something of a rupture in the essay, or a moment of disturbance in the force, where technology seems to have, according to Adorno, again, technology is enabling this the technology of the phonograph record um, seems to have made something possible that has never been possible before, and that, in a sense, moves us closer to the utopian goal of a universal form of communication, more particularly a universal form of writing, that Adorno says cannot be denied as a kind of positive force, a sort of a redemptive force. So for that, I guess we're going to sort of trace that surprising path, or the path and surprising conclusions, the not surprising path, and then all of a sudden the interesting turnaround of this essay in this podcast. You have a comment or a question, or
Yeah, and
is that
I don't
okay?
I'm just gonna put it out now.
Sure.
It's funny because as you're talking your way through this, um, I'm not convinced that
Mhm.
the end is an about face, or that this is really wholehearted, full-throated optimism. I don't feel that he's terribly optimistic at the end.
Now, you please. I did not say full-throated optimism and use that term
No,
in
no.
the
I just
same sentence with Theodore W. Adorno. I did not do
there's a
that.
part of me that almost feels that, and maybe I don't know. It almost
I
feels
I
like
could I could see that you were not pleased with my description of my account of the redemptive
no,
force.
it's not that. I just feel like, and maybe this is part of the reason why I don't have um
Mhm.
the full. I don't have all the beans tonight. Um, because it just seemed so
Mhm.
pessimistic about it. I almost feel like the end of it is sort of like saying, well, we've got this knife and you can cut yourself with it so many different ways, but the handle will not kill you. Like the
Well, yeah. I mean, this will be an interesting point for us to discuss, I think.
yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into it now because we do have some full throated condemnation to deal with before we get
We're certainly comfortable in that territory.
yeah, and so is Tough Teddy, as you've taken to calling him. But so yeah, let's jump in and talk about what the arguments here are and how we see them.
Um, well, let me say that I fully, I was giving the big sell on the episode, but I totally take your point that the reversal, rupture, redemptive moment that he speaks of is of a curious nature in the text. It's a curious moment in the text. And I think I would make the, or will make the argument that for Adorno, it does represent a kind of, I think he is working hard to say this is a unexpected development. This possible significance of the phonograph record, or the invention of the phonograph record, is highly significant.
Mm-hmm.
I would make the case that he is pretty much saying that. Now, whether or not it's redemptive in the sense that, to bring him up, since we'll probably bring him up again, um, this particular moment, this particular turn in Adorno is inspired by Walter Benjamin. We talked about Walter Benjamin in a previous episode. And of course, Adorno and Benjamin went back and forth about cinema, and this argument that photography and eventually cinema were liberating technologies because they, in destroying the aura of the work of art, they were making possible a democratization. Technology was making possible democratization of art. And it truly is a democracy, a secular redemptive moment in Benjamin. Whether or not the phonograph record functions in exactly that way. Now, Jeffrey DeLeo and other interpreters of commentators on this essay do make that argument that this is where Adorno, even though ironically enough, Adorno um, famously rejected in many ways some of Benjamin's arguments, including his argument about maybe especially his argument about the redemptive power and the politically revolutionary force of cinema. That this moment, this about face, seemed to be inspired by Benjamin, but whether or not it's truly redemptive in the Benjaminian sense, whether it functions in the same way, whether that moment functions in the same way that, say, the destruction of aura, um, as a destruction of aura argument functions in Benjamin's essay, I don't know. That's something we'll discuss. But
All right.
anyway, so shall we move to familiar territory? Let's move to familiar territory. I picked a couple comments from a pickle. I
Did you
picked a
though?
couple pickles. I picked a couple choice passages from Theodore W. Adorno's essay that we'll discuss and we'll just sort of work through. And even though we're not visual here, I'm going to share the screen so Michael can see what I'm talking about. So the first passage that maybe we can talk about, Michael, is from the opening paragraph, and we're reading from Thomas Y. Levin's translation of the essay. In terms of its form, he opens up with this really wonderful. We should talk about this. Let me read. In fact, let me. I didn't plan on this, but I should read this. This is a pretty well written, well crafted sentence. One that he talks about the form of the phonograph record, and it's a beautifully descriptive passage, right? One does not want to accord it any form other than the one it itself exhibits. A black pane made of a composite mass, which these days no longer has its honest name anymore. Then automobile fuel is called benzene, fragile like tablets, with a circular label in the middle that still looks most authentic when adorned with the pre-war terrier hearkening to his master's voice. At the very center, a little hole that is at times so narrow that one has to re-drill it wider so that the record can be laid upon the planter. Now, Michael, you may not be old enough to remember this, but did you ever have to do that? Did you ever have to sort of I remember taking knives to the middle of a label and sort of whittling away because otherwise it wouldn't fit on my turntable. Did
I
you ever have that experience?
I
Or
never
was it always a perfect fit?
I think so. That or I was just wildly impatient and just made it fit. But I never had I'm certainly I remember well spinning the cassette tape on the pencil to rewind and
Yes,
fast
right,
forward,
right,
but I
right.
don't remember having to drill out my records to listen to them. No.
Yeah. Well, I didn't drill it out, but I actually had to get a knife and sort of scrape out the center so I could actually play it. Well, my only purpose in reading that passage is even in translation, it's really well crafted and it gives you a sense, of what vinyl looks like and how it was, the presentation of it. So it's important. And especially now, since no one knows or cares about the format, it's good that he sort of memorialized it there. But let's get to the meat of the matter, shall we?
Let's
As perhaps the first of the technological artistic inventions, the phonograph record already stems from an era that cynically acknowledges the dominance of things over people through the emancipation of technology from human requirements and human needs, and through the presentation of achievements whose significance is not primarily humane. Instead, the need for the record is initially produced by advertisement once the thing already exists and is spinning in its own orbit. Nowhere does there arise anything that resembles a form specific to the phonograph record in the way that one was generated by photography in the early days. So, one of the things, now let's talk about that passage, and that passage already compacts, I think, a lot of vintage era, old school, OG Adorno, right?
Hmm.
Let's take down the format. I'll start the enumeration, and Michael, you can join in, and
I will.
we'll beat up the phonograph record. So the first one is this idea that uh, the phonograph record, even before it exists, there's an advertisement ready for it. In other words, it exists, it's made to be sold, i.e., so that's important, this thing. Instead, the need is not produced by the music itself or the performance. It's initially produced, ushered into the world by an advertisement. So phonograph record is always already, to use the well-worn phrase, a commodity. That's one of the things that means.
Yeah, and so the thing I thought here, I'm trying to find where in this text it was. Um, Nowhere does there arise anything that resembles a form specific to the phonograph record. It's as if he's also sort of already, this the form of the phonograph is the bastard artifact, right? Like with the form of the image, you have the art in your hand. Um, with photography, pardon me.
With photography, yeah,
Yeah,
right,
but
exactly.
with here with the record, and I think this is nice little foreshadowing for where he goes. But the record is not the art. There's a distinction he's
Right, exactly,
drawing
exactly,
between the
exactly,
artifact and I
exactly.
like also maybe I'm finding some beans here. Maybe I'm just getting cranky as the evening wears on. This is not humane. This is inhumane. He uses that language a few times in the essay that the art
Yes,
the
yes,
form is not humane. Again, I think there's this move that he's making to distance. One of his sticking points is that the product of this technological advancement, the vinyl disc, is not art, and what it
right,
contains, and we'll get to this. But this is really what it contains is a problem that is not only not art, but is also in his mind working against the art that it would like Sontag argues that the image is not the moment.
right.
Adorno is setting up the argument that the artifact is not the art, and that what is contained within the artifact, i.e., the record that you play, produces this thing,
Mhm.
but that thing's not art either. This is the bastard artifact, the bastard child of art.
It's just a black paint. No matter what you do, there's nothing special about the photograph, about the inscription in this case. It's
No,
always a black pane made of a composite mass, et cetera, et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera.
he
Right?
was not
That's
ready
it.
for he was not ready for colored vinyl. This
He
would
was
have
not.
this would not have worked for him. We'd have problems.
It wouldn't work. And let's do a little slow mo here about, and this is why this is the Adorno that we're familiar with from, say, the dialectic of enlightenment, right? In the culture industry, one of the pull quotes from the culture industry chapter is that technology in, I don't remember the exact phrase, but it's basically this idea that in the capitalist age, technology is always already linked to domination. The
Mm-hmm.
logic of technology is always the logic of domination because of the economic system that, in which technology is put into service. And we have that idea here, right? Here's the thing: as perhaps the first of the technological artistic inventions, and so he's talking about it in terms of the age of industrial capitalism. Like, this is kind of a throwback to the age of industrial capitalism, which was already an age. And this is what he writes: it already stems from an era, the era of industrial 19th century industrial capitalism. He's writing this in the 1930s, but he's saying this is basically a holdover from the factory. This had its birth really in the 19th century. And the 19th century was the age in which technology, it was the age of industrial capitalism, an era. Now, here I'll read him word for word: an era that cynically acknowledges. So it's like the idea we go into the technology We develop the technology, not with the idea that technology is going to liberate us. No, we build technologies that cynically, quote, acknowledge the dominance of things over people. A technology that always already, I'll not use that phrase again, but it always, like our presupposition with the technology is that it's going to bolster the idea, reinforce the idea that things are more important than people. And that's what the phonograph record gives us.
Mm-hmm.
Things are more important than people. Well, shall we move on to the next calumny against the phonograph record, or do you have other comments
No,
from that?
let's continue to traipse through the daisies with
Let's traipse through the days. This is the fun stuff, right?
that's
The
right.
criticism until we get the redemptive moment. This is Adorno in his comfort zone. Okay, so Michael, let's talk about this. I'll pick up a little bit later on, and I'll pick up a little bit earlier. Here too, a pure identity reigns between the form of the record disc and that of the world in which it plays. Okay, the sentence Adorno's not up to no good. So he and let's say this before I should mention this before we go on. What he's been doing really, and what he does for most of the short essay, is say that there's a kind of identity between the object of the and the form of the phonograph record and the more repressive aspects of capitalism. So that's what basically he's saying here. Here too, a pure identity reigns between the form of the record disc and that of the world in which it plays. Okay. The hours of domestic existence that while themselves away along with the record are too sparse for the first movement of the eroica to be allowed to unfold without interruption. Dances composed of dull repetitions are more congenial to these hours of our leisure time. Our leisure time, according to Adorno, has been reprogrammed, restructured, so that it's merely a break from the more important work time that we're all part of and that we all are being sacrificed to.
Right. So
And so, too, music is being reformatted and restructured. So, do you have a comment here?
yeah,
I
I
just want to
do.
finish the rest
Maybe
of the
it's a
paragraph.
comment or a
Yeah, sure.
question about how you're
Yeah,
reading
yeah,
this. So
sure.
here too, pure identity reigns between the form of the
Yeah.
record disc and that of the
Mhm.
world in which it plays. So, and then he says, the hours of domestic existence that while themselves away are too sparse. So the question I have, and it's a chicken or the egg question, is
Uh-huh.
are we is has everything been simplified and dumbed down because of technological advancement, or is the form just a part of the age where everything is dumbed down? Like the
Wow.
argument here seems to be that the recorded music, the phonograph, is incapable of producing a an artistic density, right? And
Yes,
that's
absolutely. That's wonderfully put too.
and that's
Yeah.
problematized further. I think I stopped you here. He continues by saying one can turn them off at any point.
Yeah. Right.
The
Right.
phonograph record is an object of that daily need,
Right.
which is the
Mhm.
very antithesis of the humane and the artistic, since
Since
the
the latter.
latter
Mhm.
cannot be repeated and turned on and on at will, but remain tied to their place in time.
Right.
So,
Right.
is has mechanization and technological advancement put us in a place where we're incapable, pardon me, of really absorbing and engaging with, I'll use the word again, I guess, the density of art? Or have we just or do we just exist in a world where there is the business of work and everything outside of the business of work is necessarily simple and banal?
Huh.
And then the form, which poorly imitates art because it removes it from its origin, right? It creates a cheap facsimile of art, and therefore is everything that is not art now just a cheap something, a cheap disposable experience?
Well, that's a fantastic question. And I don't know if I can answer it straightaways, but I can give two sideways answers for it. So first, first sub answer or try and attempt at an answer or sideways answer would be this. One point he keeps on making. I mean, I guess my best answer to your question is, Michael, all of that at once. I mean, I think he is saying, I don't know if he is, I think he's saying that these pernicious processes that you're naming, right? I mean, it's like different versions of bad things is what you're describing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think he does feel that it's kind of the worst of all possible worlds. It's a melange. I don't know if he's separating them. I think he is saying that we're in a couple different complexes. So here's what I think there's a complexity of bad things. I mean, if I understand your question, you're thinking, is he saying this one bad thing is happening, or is he saying another bad thing is happening? And I
No,
think
I think
actually,
both. I think they
okay,
can coexist, right?
I think they can too. And that was my answer to it. I think he is saying precisely that. I think he's saying that it's a it's a big mess of bad things. Okay. So yeah, I no, I then I think that's the answer to your question. Here's one. There are a lot of bad parts here. Here's one bad part of it. One bad part of it, he makes his point not here, but elsewhere in the essay. One bad part of this mess we're in has to do with the fact that he has an argument which may have been true in the 20s and 30s. It may still be true today, even in the digital age. We could talk about this if you're interested. Um, One of the challenges that classical performances offered for recordings, classical music offers for recordings, is the sheer length of of a symphony, of an opera, right? The sheer
Mm-hmm.
length of it. So one of the things that was absolutely a problem, and also how do you record an orchestra, right? So just like the logistical problems of recording an orchestra, right? So classical music really presented problems for recording technology all through the 20th century, really, even to the present day. Even when there were no longer phonograph records and there were CDs, still problems multiplied in the new media. Classical music is a bitch to record. So there's that. And one of the points he makes, and he uses this to denigrate or to criticize the phonograph record, that basically phonograph records are not. Adorno lives in a world where there's light music, popular music, and
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote serious music. Serious music was music in the symphonic tradition. He's German. Serious music is Wagner, is Alban not Wagner. Well, Wagner, yes, but he hates Wagner, but certainly Schoenberg, Alban Berg, Mahler, Strauss. That's serious music. And recording technology was at a loss at that time to capture serious music. So that's one part of the problem, right? That's one part of
Mm-hmm.
the mess. The technology privileges so-called popular music, so-called light music, as opposed to serious music like Beethoven. And now let me segue and also in part answer to your question. Let me return to the quote because I think this is another thing your question was getting at. So the hours of domestic evidence that while themselves away along with the record are too sparse for the first movement of the Eroica by Beethoven to be allowed to unfold without interruption. So he's also saying another thing the phonograph record is screwing up is this idea that if you go to Beethoven, if you listen to that symphony, if you listen to the Eroica Symphony, you're going to have to commit yourself to staying in the performance uninterrupted, and you're going to have to commit a huge chunk of time. Now, in the new workday, where leisure time has its function only within within the hierarchy of work leisure time, then you don't have time for that. You don't have time for aesthetic delectation, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to be able to play part of the eroica, right? And turn it off when you need to go to bed, right? So, so I mean that also seemed to be what you're talking about. That's what you were asking about, like what's wrong with the system. One of
Mm-hmm.
the things is art takes too much time, and we don't have enough time to give it. And the phonograph record proves that to him, even though it's portable, even though we're bringing it into our own home space. We are constricted by other things. So this basically is constricting the musical experience and not liberating the
Well,
musical
I think
experience.
it's not even though.
Uh-huh.
I think it's because, right? Like part
Uh-huh.
of the portability of this is you now strip the art of its context.
Oh, indeed, indeed,
And
indeed, indeed. Yeah,
we can't trust people to understand what that context should be.
sure.
So you can't properly formulate that on your own. This to me again is that argument. This removes gatekeeping, right? This now lets you listen to it as you want, when you want, in the order that you want, and that's not art. That's a box of crayons. That's not the
Well,
art.
Michael, that's a great point. Do you think that that is really, and is that what Adorno is upset about? Because he does want to gatekeep for serious art. So is this problem is that the domestic listener is not able to recognize the greatness of Beethoven, and they're messing with the record and they're now listening to the record?
Well, again, I'm inclined to say I think that the answer is yes and
Mm-hmm.
right. Like I think that's probably certainly on his mind. I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is one of those situations where the technology presents a vastly altered landscape. And as we had alluded to at the very beginning of the recording tonight, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. Oh, well, this might not be a major problem, and we might actually be able to derive some good from it. But I don't like what I'm seeing here. I think it's all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's move to the
Um,
third. Should we move on?
we can move on to the third redemptive moment, the dramatic turnaround. But before we do, and we don't have to linger on this, but is this a good place for us to think about modernity? I'm not modernity, our time, our moment. Do we want to talk about whether or not this critique of the phonograph holds true in the streaming world?
You
Or
know,
should we just move to the redemptive moment? We can do
no.
that.
In the true spirit of tough Teddy. Let's do
Yes,
both. Let's look at the conclusion here, and then I think I want to also talk about how his conclusion fits with everything else as well. In other words, let's take a total. Let's take a full a full survey of the landscape.
let's do it. Let's do it. Let's go to redemptive moment number one. In fact, number one, two, and three, since there aren't that many redemptive moments in here. And it's, of course, suitably near the end. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of a passage. Interrupt me whenever you wish.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of reversal. Well, I've been categorizing this passage as variously as a reversal, a kind of reversal in the essay, an attempt to redeem the technology, and but my words may be wrong. So let's hear the passage, and we'll reconsider my terminology. So the dead art, in this case, the dead art. I'll pick up from the sentence right before here, so the dead art will be clear. Oh, that strange phrase will make a little bit more sense. Okay, there is no doubt that as music is removed by the phonograph record. Okay, this is exactly what you were talking about a moment ago.
Right.
There is no doubt that as music is removed from its context, as music is removed, that's what you were talking about a moment ago. There is no doubt that as music is removed by the phonograph record from the realm of live production and from the imperative of artistic activity and becomes petrified in the form of the phonograph record, it absorbs into itself in this process of petrification the very life that would otherwise vanish. Now, wait.
So that sounds like optimism.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was about to say. Wait a minute. Instead of saying it's stamping out life as it's moving from into it, as it deprives the performance from its context, we have a surprising moment. The very life that would otherwise vanish is being preserved in the form of the phonograph record. What is going on? What is happening? We continue. The dead art in the phonograph record rescues the ephemeral and perishing art as the only one alive. Therein may lay the phonograph's record's most profound justification. Do my eyes deceive me? Is there a profound justification for this heinous technology, which cannot be impugned by an aesthetic objection to its reification? Don't break my heart, Tough Teddy. You are at your best when you are objecting to reification. It's all about objecting to reification. Surely this is not true. But he continues. For this justification reestablishes by the very means of reification an age-old, submerged, and yet warranted relationship that exists between music and writing. Hey, did we find a typo? I think we did. We found I think we found a typo here with our close reading madness. Submerged and yet warranted relationship that
No,
between
that
music
that
and writing.
relationship, relationship between music and writing.
Oh, okay. So I just am a poor reader. I thought there was a word left out. Okay, let's stop that moment. Let's continue. Anyone who has ever recognized a steadily growing compulsion, and I'll pick up here because we want to comment on this. Anyone who has ever recognized a steadily growing compulsion that at least during the last 50 years, both musical notation and the configuration of the musical score have imposed on composition will not be surprised if one day a reversal of the following sort occurs. Music, previously conveyed by writing, suddenly itself turns into writing. This occurs at the price of its immediacy, yet with the hope that once fixed in this way, it will someday be, and here's the startling sentence. It will someday, music in this new form, in the form of the phonograph record, will someday become readable as, quote, the last remaining universal language since the construction of the Tower of Babel, a language whose determined and yet encrypted expressions are contained in each of its phrases. Now, since I've been reading a long time, I'll very quickly, I'll try to bow out quickly by giving Jeffrey DeLeo's great sort of précis of what's going on in this passage. And it's something like this, that what Adorno is noting is that music has always, in a sense, been inscribed because of its intangible nature. Music has always been sort of limited, or the only way toward permanence of music was the development of writing, the development of musical notation. So in a way, even though performance is of the essence of music, there's a curious way in which it was always enslaved by writing, or always subordinated to the fact of musical notation.
As in, you can't have a performance without the written notation there from
at every
which
point
to perform. Right.
at every point. I mean, the written notation is a script,
Well,
right?
which always precedes the music.
Which always precedes the music. So there is a curious way in which, yeah, there's a curious way in which music has always been tied to writing, and that tie, in a sense, kept it fettered. It's been fettered to writing, and now the form of the phonograph record itself is inscription. Itself is a kind of writing, and now the performance is free. And let's just think of how this worked out in the form of popular music. How many people, can you count the popular musicians who cannot read music, but they learned how to compose,
Right.
right? By what? By reading notation. They may not know anything about notation. They just hear things on records and try to replicate it. They try to replicate the writing that's on the phonograph record
Without writing.
without writing.
Right.
So there is this kind of reversal almost a utopian thing. And that practice is utopian and democratizing in the same way that um, the dream of a universal language would have the same, or the immediacy of the internet. We're talking about a technology that literally restructures human brain patterns, human perception, and human networking, and human communication, and human interactions. So there is this weird, a kind of liberation that's more extensive than, say, the liberate. We talked a lot about um, Bazin and the ways in which he sort of lionized the invention of the photograph as liberating painting from reality, and as standing for a kind of liberation from reality. Um, Adorno is critical of cinema and photography as an automatic mode of liberation. But in this curious moment at the end, he knows this reversal is a truly revolutionary thing. This reversal where music now has been inscribed in the phonograph record and liberates music from writing. That seems to be a truly universal and unexpected development.
Yeah. So in looking through it this time with you, I almost feel like I need to maybe recant and reframe this conclusion not as this seems to be a bigger deal in light of everything else that we've talked about. This, so I'll ask you a question
Hmm.
about this, right? We say, okay, this is bad, right? So basically what the phonograph does is it encourages consumerism, right? And it is watered down serious music, giving us, this
Only
is
what fits in the record player, right? It
right.
only
That's
gives us
it. So
that, right?
you have
That's it.
simple music now. It's not you've decontextualized it. We've made it it doesn't function as art anymore. But the good news here is that it at the same time that it's watering and devaluing the art, at least it's elevating the art to a primary position above writing. Is that last point
Mhm.
significant enough to celebrate the phonograph record?
That's a great question. Um,
Because I don't know,
well,
like the first time I
well,
went through it, I was like, this is this really seems like an oh, by the way, it's not wholly horrible. But as I'm looking at it now, you know, you my first thought here was like, well, what's the big deal? Are you worried that somehow recorded music is going to kill performance? Or is this going to kill the performance of art? And that's not it. The problem is that the performance can't exist without the written word,
right,
that you
right,
can never
right,
have
right.
music as an art form be the primary thing. It will always be subject to other things. And writing, I don't think, is the only one, right? Like it has to be performed in a particular place. You have to
Sure,
have the
sure.
artisans to create the music there. There's a number of things that are going
Mhm.
to happen that puts the actual art
Mhm.
secondary or tertiary
Mhm.
in the hierarchy. And now it's like, wait, no, this elevates art. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't like. There's a lot of devaluing going on.
Mhm.
But is it worth that devaluing to people who likely were never really they're on the wrong side of the gate to begin with?
Mhm. Well, I mean, reading at this time, I don't know. I think we've reached one of those moments where we where we typically throw in the towel. I'm not going to throw in the towel quite yet, but I'm almost, I don't know
I
if I
wouldn't
can
blame you. I
answer
don't
that
I don't
question.
I that in a way is me throwing in the towel. Like I don't I hadn't thought of this before now,
Well,
but
when you were talking about like when you saw the passage again, you had this new thought about it. I had a new thought reading the passage. And I have to say, reading it aloud, I was more impressed that it is a revolutionary thing. The idea that you have, I think it is a revolutionary thing to be able to. I'm working with the Tower of Babel thing. I think that's the Tower of Babel metaphor, or the dream of a universal language. I'm working with that idea. That's the idea that sort of hit me this time when I reread it. When you think about what universal language is, or that idea of the universal does to the human. Like what's important about a universal language? It creates a kind of new mode of intercommunication, a new kind of exchange, and a
Mm-hmm.
new portability to art, right? A new portability to it. Now, when you think of it that way, I mean, so he's saying the phonograph gives a new portability that's not necessarily limited by musical notation, that it gives this kind of ability, or the work of art, of the phonograph record rather, well,
Mm-hmm.
not the work of art, but the phonograph record, that material object can translate and be used in so many different contexts. That does strike me as a
It
huge game
also,
changer.
and the other thing is, he says, is one of the things that the recording does is it removes time. So we're no
Exactly.
longer bound by temporal constraints either. So you now have,
It does seem utopian, right? I mean,
yeah, like, I don't know. Did we, have we found an about face here at the 11th hour where Tough Teddy suddenly has the heart of gold and is saying, wait a minute, this is a
well,
technology that,
well, let's linger with that for a moment. Think about the difficulty, compare the difficulties. Let's linger on your last point, because I think that was a really brilliant point. And I think what we've been, in my comment and your comment, what we're grappling with is this idea of this unit. So what he's really saying in that about face in that paragraph is he's saying that the phonograph record, in undoing that hierarchy, all of a sudden speaks a universal language. Well, let's go immediately to what you just said. Freeing the record, freeing the recording, or freeing the performance from time constraints, not just our time. Now, the bad part of it, he already talked about, right? That we can, in a sense, domesticate the time of the work of art
mm-hmm.
to make it sort of fit our needs, and and we submit it
Right.
to a
But
new
what
kind of
I'm talking
domination.
more is about, this fits in the time capsule.
But that's the other part of it, Michael. And isn't that utopian? So think of this. Think of the difficulties that our students have with reading, and this is not bagging on students, right? They have this problem because it's difficult. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's not it's a real problem. But think of the difficulties. Just think a moment. I have to assign, or you have to assign, a Dickens novel. We know that it takes a different kind of literacy or training, right?
Right.
To read a text, and I pick Dickens, but I really, the thing I'm thinking of is, empowered by your example, inspired by your example. Um, what I'm really thinking of is the difficulties we have in reading a text that's 100 years old, right?
Right.
It usually requires, even in the same language, it requires kind of training, the development of certain kind of literacies and competencies. Okay, let's compare it to listening to Robert Johnson, Duke Ellington, or
Mm-hmm.
the fact that, now, this doesn't dominate the radio, but you probably can find 60s rock and roll, 50s jazz, Miles Davis on some radio scan, even on terrestrial radio. Probably can. We're talking about recordings that are up, they're not 100 years old, but they're 60 years old or 70 years old, and no one bats an eyelash.
Mm-hmm.
That in itself is a kind of liberation for time. And isn't that kind of utopian?
Mm-hmm.
Am I crazy? But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of utopian.
No, I see this different, and it's so. Let me point to just one last passage here. If we
Sure,
go to the
sure.
very end of this, okay, he says to wrap up the essay, what may be announcing itself here, however, is the shock at that transfiguration of all truth of artworks that iridescently discloses itself in the catastrophic technological progress. Pause there
That's
for a
it.
second, right?
That's it. That's it.
Technology is
That's
not,
it.
it's a catastrophe, right?
But
Ultimately, the phonograph records are not artworks, right? So he's never saying, but that's not about it. The phonograph encapsulates, it holds, it is a container, right? So ultimately, the phonograph records are not artworks, but the black seals on the missives that are rushing towards us from all sides and the traffic with technology. Missives whose formulations capture the sounds of creation, the first and the last sounds, judgment upon life, and message about that which may come thereafter. This
I mean,
seems very
so
celebratory here.
totally celebratory. And you know what? Those last phrases, this is really where he gets Benjaminian. It's the language of religion,
Mm-hmm.
the language of the last trump, of the last judgment, of first and last things. But yeah, this is a moment of religious transcendence, like the divine entering the
Right.
secular realm, the
He's
worldly realm.
careful to keep technology in its place.
Right.
And he's careful to make explicitly clear that the vinyl recording, excuse me, that the what is his the phonograph record itself, the artifact, the right, is
It's not
not the
art.
thing.
It's not
And I
art.
think that's what distinguishes and what enables him to make this argument that's different than photography or film even or painting, is that the technological thing is separate from the art itself. This is merely a conduit for the art. So I
Right.
think as much as he
Really good point.
hates the technological push, I'm going to argue that, yeah, the juice is worth the squeeze, because this immortalizes it. This keeps it, and in doing so elevates it above that pesky writing business.
And you know what, Michael, you made me, I'm very glad you read that passage because, the first part of the passage ending with, what was it? Catastrophic
Yeah,
technological
catastrophic
progress. But,
technological
but,
progress.
but, I mean, in a sense, those two sentences are the form of the essay. Like everything that, you and I were talking about in those earlier passages, they were grim, right? It was grim.
Mm-hmm.
It was vintage Adorno, but it was because he was still writing within that perspective of I am describing the catastrophic technological progress. But
Mm-hmm.
then in that final sentence you read, that's where he that's where he turns. That's where he gets beyond the progress and said, yes, this really is part of this is inextricable from a disastrous thing. But there's something I don't know. This is why I was using the word redeem earlier. This is a kind of a weird redemptive event that's occurred as well.
Yeah, I
A
feel like we've
singularity has occurred. There's kind of a singularity. This is, I mean, a weak version of the singularity that that not the work of art, right? But the inscription of the work of art, the phonograph record, has brought a singularity into the world that no one could have anticipated.
I dig it. I got some beans.
We're done.
Shall we
I think
leave
this
it?
is it. I
All
think we
right.
I think we've done all we can do. There's
I'm
nothing more we can do.
no, who would try? Barry, this was one of those interesting moments where I didn't see us landing here, but I'm glad we did. So thank you, as always, for a good
A
conversation.
pleasure. A pleasure. Thank you again,
We
Michael.
we will not be doing 12 more
10
episodes of
more. At
Adorno.
least 10. At
I don't
least
think
10.
so. But we will come with something interesting next time.
All right. Sounds good. Thank
All
you
right,
again,
Barry.
Michael.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.